Hi, today I'm going to be talking about human fertility decline. In almost every country on Earth, the birth rate has fallen below the amount needed to keep the population stable over time. People have a lot of theories about why this is happening, but no single theory has been able to fully explain the phenomenon. I have my own ideas about why this is happening, and I haven't heard anyone else express these ideas in quite the way that I think about them, and so I'm making this video to share my theory of human fertility decline with you all here on YouTube. Basically, what's happening is something similar to what happens when animals are put into captivity and refuse to reproduce, for example, in a zoo. This is pretty common with captive animals, that although the animal has everything that it needs to survive for a long period of time, the environment isn't sufficient to support voluntary reproduction. This is because the people setting up the animals' enclosure in captivity didn't fully understand what the animals needed in order to reproduce. To that you might say, but modern humans live better than any humans have in the history of humans, so what could we possibly be missing? And to that I say, just because we have more luxuries and more technology, that doesn't mean that we have everything necessary to support voluntary reproduction. Imagine if you were a zookeeper and you had a couple of elephants in an enclosure and they wouldn't reproduce. And so you installed a big screen TV with 100 channels and a solid gold toilet and every luxury you could think of, and then the elephants still wouldn't reproduce. Would you just throw your hands up in the air and say, well, we've given them every luxury. They have a solid gold toilet. What more could they possibly want? When in reality, those types of luxuries aren't something that elephants need in order to reproduce at all. What they need is something completely different. There are multiple factors that contribute to the refusal or failure of elephants to reproduce in captivity, but one big part of the problem is that in the wild, elephants live in complex matriarchal family groups where the other female elephants in the herd provide support for the mother and her calf. If you have two elephants in an enclosure, they know that they don't have that kind of support. And so they're not going to reproduce. They're going to look around at their environment and say, this environment is not sufficient to raise a calf, so let's not make one. Something very similar is happening with humans. So something I want to point out here is that most people live with an unquestioned assumption that civilization is a natural state for humanity. Another assumption is that there could be some set of circumstances under which civilization would continue indefinitely, and if it collapses, it's because we did something wrong. Most people don't even consider the possibility that civilization is an aberration and that it's a miracle that it's continued for as long as it has, and the fact that it's continued for any period of time at all is kind of an accident. Humans have existed on this planet for about 300,000 years, but we only started doing agriculture about 10 to 12,000 years ago. That means that for only about 5% of the time that humans have existed have we been living in settled communities and doing agriculture. The time before that, that entire 290,000 years, we lived as hunter-gatherers. That is our ancestral environment. That's the environment in which we evolved to have such an extended period of helplessness at the beginning of our lives. Human childhood is kind of extreme. Raising a human child is very labor-intensive. For the first 6 months to a year, babies wake up multiple times a night needing to be fed. And then for the first 3 to 4 years of life, human children need almost constant supervision. They develop the ability to walk and run before they develop the ability to evaluate whether a situation is safe or dangerous. A lot of animals are able to function independently immediately after birth or hatching because their behaviors rely mostly on instinct. Humans, on the other hand, we reach a much higher level of cognitive functioning as adults, but in order to facilitate that, we need more time for our nervous systems to develop. Humans' nervous systems aren't fully developed at birth. And our extended period of childhood allows for that continued development. If you've ever thought about this for longer than 10 seconds or so, you would realize that the needs of babies and children are basically at odds with the needs of their parents if you assume that children will be raised in isolation by one or two people without any help from other adults. It's an extreme amount of work and sacrifice for one or two people, especially if you consider that those people will still need to do everything necessary to provide for their own needs. Even after having a baby, people still need to eat. They still need to get adequate sleep. And providing hands-on around-the-clock care for a baby by yourself makes that almost impossible. The newborn phase in particular is absolutely brutal. Babies sleep for about 3 to 4 hours at a time, and then they wake up and someone has to feed them. This makes it really hard to get enough sleep when you're a new mom. And we've basically accepted it as normal that new moms won't get adequate sleep for years after their child is born. It's one of those things that if you complain about it, people will act like you're being ridiculous and it's just a normal part of motherhood, and they'll say, well, all of your ancestors had to do the same thing and they all survived, so stop whining, you're just being weak. But the fact is that, for one thing, humans evolved co-sleeping with their babies, which meant that the mom could breastfeed off and on during the night without having to fully wake up, which allowed moms to get a lot better quality of sleep. Another thing is that if you're home with your baby all day, you can sleep when your baby sleeps, which allows you to make up for sleep during the day that you didn't get at night. But in modern times, women are expected to go back to work when their babies are 8 weeks old, which eliminates any possibility of getting sleep throughout the day. Sleep is not a luxury or a nice to have, it's a biological need. And it's pretty well known that all kinds of terrible things happen to your health if you don't get enough sleep. Your cognitive functioning goes way downhill. It can contribute to things like obesity, anxiety, depression. It can even cause psychosis. It can decrease your reaction time so that you're more likely to get into an accident. Another thing about having a baby is that it increases your need for resources while simultaneously reducing your capacity for productive output, meaning that it's much harder to meet your own needs while caring for a baby. In a situation where you're expected to meet your own needs through your own productive output and not depend on help from anyone else in your community, having a baby becomes an existential risk. It creates a really difficult situation that most people are not able to navigate without support. In modern times, we have a culture of personal responsibility. People are shamed for asking for help from other people. There's an expectation that you're going to provide for your own needs and the needs of your family without having to ask anyone else for resources. And your community doesn't have a responsibility to help you. Even your family, even your siblings, your parents, if they see you struggling, they have no responsibility to do anything whatsoever to help you. In that context, a lot of people realize what a vulnerable situation becoming a parent would put them in, and they rightfully recognize that they don't have the resources available to successfully navigate that. This is one reason why women's standards for marriage partners have become so high, because they know that motherhood is extremely risky and costly. And so they're looking for a partner who has enough financial resources to overcome those costs and risks. The vast majority of men don't earn enough money to compensate a woman for everything that she loses by becoming a mother. And that's why women only want to marry the top 10 to 20% of earners. Because marrying and reproducing with someone who earns less than that is going to reduce her financial security and standard of living. At this point, you would probably like to point out that our great-grandparents had 10 kids in a one-room shack with no electricity and no running water and nowhere near the level of support that I'm saying that people would need in order to voluntarily reproduce. While that's technically true, it's not evidence of voluntary reproduction. What we had in those times was coerced reproduction. Everything in society was set up to force women to reproduce whether they wanted to or not. Women had to get married because men were the only ones who could own property, and the only way that a woman could get access to the things that she needed in order to live was by marrying a man so that he would allow her access to his resources. And once women got married, they would end up with a bunch of kids, whether they wanted them or not. Before the modern day fertility decline started, women would regularly have 7 to 10 children. That is a lot of children. I seriously doubt that very many of them really wanted to have 7 to 10 children. I don't think that there are a whole lot of people who want to spend 10 to 15 years just being pregnant and then caring for a newborn and then being pregnant again and then caring for a newborn again and then being pregnant again. Regardless of whether women actually wanted that life or not, that was the norm, and it was enforced with patriarchal religions. For example, Catholicism teaches that any sex you could have that couldn't lead to pregnancy is a sin. The only kind of sex that's approved for a husband and wife to have in Catholicism is the kind of sex that gets you pregnant. And also they taught that it was God's will that women should be subservient to their husbands and that they shouldn't be able to own property, and men should be the one making the majority of the decisions, and women were just there to help the man carry out his vision of what their life should be. What this does is it separates the decision making when you have one person making the decision of when and how many kids the family is going to have, while another person is bearing almost all of the consequences of that decision. You end up with way more kids than you would if you left it up to women to decide. Women knew that they could die in childbirth, and they also knew that pregnancy is risky and uncomfortable, and that babies are very demanding and would require a ton of work. But men were the ones deciding how many kids they would have. And from the man's perspective, children were an economic asset. The man's standard of living benefited from having a lot of children, because once the children reached about age 5 or so, they were a source of labor. They were an economic asset to the family. And so men had every incentive to want their wives to have more children. Not only that, but they were surrounded by this entire worldview and culture that told them that this is what God wants. God wants your wife to have as many children as possible. He told us to be fruitful and multiply, and that if you have a lot of kids, God will bless you with abundance. And reality mostly confirmed that messaging, because people were primarily relying on manual farming, and once kids reach about age 5 or so, they're able to do that type of work, and so they become useful as a source of labor. Having a lot of kids did increase people's material security in those times. In that context, the fact that people had a lot of children wasn't evidence of human flourishing or of voluntary reproduction. Especially since as soon as economic circumstances changed and having more children stopped being an economic boon, fertility started to decrease. So after the Industrial Revolution, men were still the ones deciding how many children their wives would have, but they no longer benefited from having a lot of kids. Men were still economically incentivized to want some children because children were a source of economic security for their parents in old age. Children would provide support to their parents in old age, and this was culturally reinforced. But we had reached a point technologically that the workforce was very stratified, And the more time and resources invested into a person's education, the more they were able to earn. That's just a side effect of having a more complex economy and workforce. You end up with a lot more stratification between earning potential of various careers, depending on how much education and training it takes to get into that career. And for that reason, it becomes more advantageous to limit the number of children that you have so that you can invest more into each one. It's around this time that people stop strictly adhering to their patriarchal religions. They'll still go to church and they'll still pay lip service to those religions, but they stop following the teachings to the letter because the cognitive dissonance becomes too much. When the church is telling you be fruitful and multiply and God will bless you, but you can look around you and see that people who have more than a couple of kids are dealing with increased poverty and struggle. The process of abandoning patriarchal religions when they no longer fit the economic reality is a slow process. It's an unraveling that happens over generations because those religions are so ingrained into the culture and socially reinforced, and people have been believing in them for so long that they forgot why they even exist in the first place. But ultimately, people don't just keep following patriarchal religions indefinitely when doing so goes against their own economic interests. Another side effect of the economy becoming more complex and the workforce becoming more stratified and diverse is that different types of jobs emerge that could be done just as easily by women as they could be done by men. Men have a big advantage over women in terms of physical strength, but they don't have an advantage over women in terms of intellectual capability or fine motor skills or interpersonal relationships. And so jobs that relied more on those types of skills could just as easily be done by women as they could by men, which allowed women to go into the workforce and earn a wage. In an industrialized economy, men typically want their wives to work because doing so increases the standard of living of the entire family by bringing in more money into the household. The problem with it is that at a certain point, women realize that they don't need to get married and they don't need to have children anymore. And that they actually, in most cases, would have a higher standard of living if they didn't get married and didn't have any kids than they would if they were to get married and have kids. For the first time, we're able to actually see whether or not our society supports voluntary reproduction, and it doesn't because it's misaligned with the biological realities of being human. Our society is actively hostile to mothers and babies. Something interesting is that women mostly still want to be mothers. When women are surveyed, they typically say that they want to have 2 to 3 children, but then they end up having 0 or 1 children, because what they really mean is that ideally they would like to have 2 to 3 children if they could have those kids without sacrificing their health or economic security. Now I have to talk about what it is that humans actually would need in order to support voluntarily reproducing. I think in order to figure that out, we have to look at how humans lived before they needed patriarchal religion and reproductive coercion in order to keep society going. We don't know everything about how humans lived before agriculture, but we know a lot because there are still hunter-gatherer societies alive today, and anthropologists have gone and lived with them and studied them and seen how they lived. They've also drawn a lot of conclusions based on observing non-human primates who are closely related to us evolutionarily. It's believed that pre-agriculture humans lived in groups of 50 to 150 individuals. There were no strangers. Everyone knew each other. It was the most high trust of high trust societies. You couldn't get away with any kind of antisocial behavior. Child rearing was a communal responsibility. The care of one baby was shared between 5 to 10 adults. We didn't raise children in isolation the way that we do now. A new mom wouldn't just have help from the father of her child, but also her siblings and her mother. And if she had any older children and her nieces and nephews, they would spend time caring for the baby. The other adults would bring the mom extra food because they knew that it wasn't realistic to expect her to go out and forage for her own food while she's providing round-the-clock care for a newborn. The community around a new mom was her security, and they would absorb a lot of the caregiving burden so that she could still enjoy a decent quality of life. People were able to provide this kind of support to women in their communities because they had way more free time than we have now. It's estimated that hunter-gatherers worked for about 4 hours a day on average to get food and the other things that they needed, and then the rest of their time was spent doing whatever they wanted, basically. They would spend a lot of time resting and telling stories and making meaning and being community for each other and making memories. And so asking them to take 2 hours out of their day to help their sister take care of her baby so that she could get some sleep, it was not a big ask. Grandmothers especially had a large role in taking care of their grandkids. It's been suggested that this is actually the reason why human women go through menopause, because at a certain age, once her children get old enough to start having their own children, there's a greater benefit to the survival of her genes by contributing to the care of her grandchildren than there would be for her to continue to have her own babies. So the women who stopped having babies and started focusing their attention on their children's children had more surviving descendants. I think it's important to point out here that in our ancestral environment, becoming a mother didn't reduce a woman's standard of living or social standing. And also, it didn't make her standard of living or social standing dependent on the father of her children. Ideally, the father of her kids would stick around and be involved in his children's lives, but even if he didn't, the risk for her wasn't existential the way that it is now. She wouldn't become any kind of social pariah. She wouldn't be shamed for needing handouts from her community. People just kind of accepted that children were the responsibility of the community and not just of the mother. This is very different from what we have currently. Ever since agriculture arose, we've had this situation where hoarding resources gets you higher social standing and it gets you a higher standard of living. And so people are incentivized to hoard resources and not want to contribute to the care of any children that aren't their own. Anyway, I plan on making more videos about this. I realize that it's a lot and that I kind of glossed over a lot of things, but I think I explained it pretty well. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments if you have any questions or if you want to agree or disagree with anything that I've said here. Thank you for watching.